Welcome back, AP. All right, fantastic job today talking about James I of England. Now, really quick little fact, though, that I forgot to tell you completely that we need to actually jot down real fast, is the fact that he's not just James I. He's actually technically called James I and VI. Right? So the reason why he's called the first and the sixth is because he's the first James of England, but he's the sixth James of Scotland, right? So he actually a lot of times is referred to as James I and VI. And I want you to know that just in case you try to look him up at any point, and you're going to end up actually running into a, wait, what's his new number? Now, he is called James I and VI. Now, we talked a lot about him today. We talked about his personality, how he's really over the top, how he's very aggressive, and how he believes that a king should rule from his palace. By the way, that palace we were referencing constantly today is called Whitehall Palace. Whitehall is where they lived before Buckingham Palace was actually created. And so Whitehall was this very large estate that James had expanded even further so he could have these giant court parties and stuff, of course, all the while he left his kids in Scotland and never talked to them. Now, the thing about it, though, is James does believe that he and his son should have the right of divine right? And we see that in the Whitehall Palace dining room with this, of course, fantastic Baroque Peter Paul Rubens piece that is all over the roof, right? So going forward, though, into this whole thing, you also need to understand that a lot of this relates back to the discrepancies of a document that had changed the way that England progressed since 1215, that document being the Magna Carta. Yeah! That's right, I said it. The Magna Carta is very important because the Magna Carta is going to create the traditions in England that are going to set up their parliamentary rights. It's going to outline the basic rights of English people, and it's also going to demonstrate the fact that the Parliament has power all its own and leads to the systems of checks and balances that are used in Western democracies, right? So looking at that document, I won't do it again. I won't hit you again with it, all right? Because I know a couple of y'all are rolling your eyes by the third Kermit. Now, looking at the entire thing, though, you have to understand that document prevented the king from doing a lot of things, right? One, he is not allowed to raise taxes without the justification of Parliament or without Parliament actually saying that he could or could not do so, right? He could not actually raise an army efficiently without that tax money, so that's going to hinder his ability to fight wars. He also is not allowed to violate certain rights, like he is not allowed to take property without just cause, right? He's not allowed to strip land and wealth just because he feels like it. He also would not be allowed to, and this is all happening in 1215. Now, actually, the king that originally signed it, King John, ignored it immediately after, but it's still fine. So also it's going to bring in the concept of the Parliament. It's going to create a bicameral legislative branch. Originally it was a council of nobles and clergy, but it evolved into the Lords and the Commons, right? So that's a big thing. Another huge thing is it said that the king must acknowledge habeas corpus. And habeas corpus is the right to a fair trial by jury, including proof of your actions, because habeas in Latin means to have, and corpus means the body, so it means to have the body of proof, in essence, right? And this is all still outlined in that same document, and then last but very last, not least, it said that the king is not above the law, right? That the king is not allowed to just do whatever he wants because he feels like it. Now, in a nutshell, though, that document is going to prevent the rise of James into the absolute monarch that he wants to become, right? And he tried to get around it. He tried 100 times to get around it, right? He tried to get around it by raising taxes that he had a right to raise, right? So, for example, there's this old tax on the books in England known as tonnage and poundage, right? Tonnage and poundage was a lifelong tax that the king was allowed to collect for themselves that all goes as a tariff on imported wine, right? Tonnage, or a ton, is a cask of wine, right? It's a big barrel of wine, and poundage basically is referring to their currency, right? So saying basically that there is a tax on all imported wine because English wine, you can't grow wine in England because of the fact that grapes don't grow there, that the king was allowed to collect that money basically like a tariff, right? But then he tried to skirt around that, right? He's tried to skirt around that and be like, oh, well, I'm going to raise it and I'm going to pass some impositions on that and raise that money, that tax money, and he's not allowed to do that. And then also he tried to do this thing called ship money, where he went up to all these different counties and cities of England and said, you have two options. You can either donate a ship to our navy or give me the money to build one for you. And so 9 times out of 10, what a city is going to do is they're going to give him the money to do that. But the parliament's like, you can't do that. You can't just tell an entire city that they had to give you a boat or money. And a lot of them these cities had already given him the money, and he didn't even use the money to make a boat. He just used the money for himself, right? So the other thing is he's gonna really make Parliament mad because the Parliament's full of Anglicans at this point. He's really going to make them mad when he arranges a marriage of his second son because of the death of his first son, Henry. His second son, Charles, gets married off to a French noblewoman who's a Catholic. So he's making a lot of people really, really upset. I think her name is Henrietta. Pretty sure her name is Henrietta. Charles I's wife. Henrietta Maria. Now, so the big thing, though, is that he's going to do that. And also, he's just going to execute Sir Walter Raleigh. Sir Walter Raleigh being the person that, was a confidant of Elizabeth I and very closely related to her and her practice, brought tobacco into England originally. Very important figure. And that whole thing really, really made the Parliament mad due to the fact that he executed Sir Walter Raleigh for treason. And Sir Walter Raleigh at the time was 66 years old, right? And a lot of it had to do with smuggling and a lot of other things going on in the background. But that guy was seen as kind of a prominent English figure who helped colonize the North Americas and also helped bring a lot of those goods back into Europe and England. So people are really frustrated with this guy. And he's having these big court parties and he's hanging out with his buddy, the Duke of Buckingham, all the time. And these feuds with Parliament are going to and stall the monetary resources of the kingdom, and they're going to prevent James from controlling his own money. And what they're going to do is every time he tries to pass any kind of tax imposition, or he tries to raise ship money, or he tries to raise tonnage and poundage, Parliament will be like, oh, we're not voting on that today. We're going to vote on that tomorrow. We don't want to vote on it right now. And they're just stalling the voting to make it so basically James feels the pain of not having any money every time he wants to have one of these parties, or if he wants to rebuild the Palace of Whitehall a third time, or if he wants to do all that stuff. And so what's going on is James then evokes a technical right that he has. This is absolutely wild. James, on the books, as a king of England, is allowed to dissolve Parliament. He's allowed to be like, not today, and fired all of them. And basically said that this session of Parliament is over. Y'all aren't voting on Doodly Squad anymore, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and we're not going to do anything until you see it my way. So it was kind of like a square off. It's like a game of chicken, right? He dissolved Parliament for a full year and still didn't get his way because the parliamentarians still just kind of held out. They were like, nobody really likes you. And the people of England hate his guts for this, right? They do not like him. They make fun of him all the time. And he only has a handful of true, success stories, right? So his biggest success is one of them being the fact that he had the very first English translation of the Bible made, right? And that's why it's called the King James Version of the Bible, which is the same Bible that y'all use in religion class. So that is actually a very important thing of him. He actually had the very first English Bible written, which is a big deal. He also had the Jamestown colony of Virginia settled. Of course, the reason why it was called Virginia is it being named after Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, right? And also it was the Virginia Company because she gave them the charter to become a company and actually go over there, joint stock. So also, he's going to charter the settlement of the Puritan separatists in Plymouth, right? And so he tells them, okay, fine, here's some land, get out of my face, right? So, that's a pretty big deal. But he is going to unfortunately die later in life. And then now comes to rise his son, Charles the First, which Abigail Winningham seemed really excited to talk about, right? This guy is the worst king in all of English history. He is such a little, bruised ego, tiny, because he was actually really, really short. I think he was 5'2" or something like that. Very tiny guy, super scrawny and skinny, had a speech impediment he tried to fix by throwing rocks into his mouth and trying to speak with that in there, where he ended up shattering a couple of his teeth when he was a younger guy. He ran constantly, thinking that would make him physically fit, but it made him super, super tiny and skinny, and he had this really aggressive ego complex. A lot of it had to do with the fact that, one, he didn't really like his dad, at all. He didn't like his dad because his dad, just left him in Scotland because he was, a sickly child and stuff like that, but just left him to be raised with his mom in Scotland, and he never actually even saw London until the day that he showed up for, not only his father's funeral, but his own coronation. That's probably aggressive. I'm sure he's seen London before. But, basically, Charles was, this super emasculated guy. And it's like almost to like spite his dad, he wanted to like show him up. And he wanted to basically be like, you tried to be an absolutist, but you let that parliament get away with too much, right? And he's going to show up and he's going to try and exert absolute authority over the parliament. And it doesn't go very well. And the entire time, his wife, Henrietta, is whispering into his ear, right? Just being like, oh, in France, we would never tolerate this. Oh, in France, we have Louis XIII and Cardinal Richelieu who rule over everything. Oh, in France. Calm down, Henrietta. All right, so now the big thing about it, though, is that he does believe in divine right just like his dad does, right? Like, look at it. He like even has portraits made just like his dad does. Also, God, look at the forehead on this guy. Now, anyway, so look, sorry. We're looking at the whole thing, though. Believes in divine right. He made the English mad, or made the English maid out the gate. Made the English mad out the gate when he married that 15-year-old French Catholic, right? Which angered Puritans, Anglicans, angered a lot of people because they felt like Catholic influence was now in the bedchamber of the king, right? So he listened to the Duke of Buckingham way too much. Literally, when he moved to London, the Duke of Buckingham, the guy that was like BFFs with his dad, becomes his most trusted advisor. This angered a lot of nobles because they were like, we're just going to get more of James, but possibly worse because his son is even more weak-willed, right? He also started issuing these things called forced loans, which he went up to nobles and lords of England that were still in existence at this time and was going up to them always and being like, loan me some money and I'll pay you back. And they would be like, no. And he would then just arrest them. Which violates the Magna Carta. Yeah! I know. Violates that entire concept. And then he's doing all this stuff so he can raise an army because he wants to try and exert his authority, right? So he tries to invade Spain one time under the Duke of Buckingham's advice, right? Tries to invade Spain, loses, right? So, and it angers everyone for wasting all of this money. He tries to, then randomly declare war on France, where his wife is from. He tries to actually declare war on France just because he wants to get inside of these, different port cities that are on the western side. And what the heck, man, what are you doing? Same thing happened right there due to the fact that the Duke of Buckingham advised him to do that. And because of that failure of invading France, actually the Duke of Buckingham gets stabbed to death by a guy that he passed over for a promotion, right? That led to the Duke of Buckingham's death. And every time he wanted to do this, when he wanted to raise taxes to go to war with Spain, when he wanted to raise taxes when he wanted to go to war with France, when he wanted to do all this stuff, every single time he would just dissolve Parliament if they didn't agree with him, right? He'd be like, I want to go to war with Spain. And they'd be like, no. And then Henrietta would apparently sneak up to him and be like, you should dissolve them. And he just would, right? So, he would dissolve Parliament. He would just go, dude, just do it. And then also on top of that, every time when he wanted to go to war with France, he'd be like, I want to go to war with France. And they'd be like, no. And then he'd dissolve Parliament again. Literally, the first Parliament that was around during his earliest reign only lasted for a month. And since they didn't do anything, they're literally called the useless Parliament. Because they just didn't do anything, right? So, he dissolved Parliament 3 different times. And all of this happened in his first 3 years of being king. First 3 years, which I was talking about with Godet a little bit ago. Years, small single-digit years, that's 5 minutes in history, right? So, in the first 3 years of his entire reign, he dissolves Parliament 3 different times, right? So, because every time he just wanted to pitch a fit and go to war, and then his wife would be like, dissolve them. You're the king. You're supposed to be doing whatever you want. He'd be like, okay, and he would just dissolve Parliament. Honestly, I think Henrietta might have been a little bit more in charge than he was. So, in the long run, though, then, one time, when he has to bring the Parliament back, and so in this entire craziness of him, dissolving Parliament, bringing back Parliament, doing it over and over and over again, trying to raise taxes on his own, he actually at one point even, had one of the parliamentarians, imprisoned in the Tower of London because he said that you can't do that. They've actually made him at one point sign a document that would become basically the Great Charter 2.0, right? It would become basically the Magna Carta 2.0, right? And so this document was known as the Petition of Brighton. So since he was actually forced to sign this, Parliament said that you can't levy taxes without them, and you're not allowed to imprison anyone without cause. It just kind of re-outlined all those ideas to get Charles to check his authority and get him to understand, we don't care what the Duke of Buckingham tells you. We don't care because you need to listen to us. And this actually happened when he brought the army back, or when he brought the Parliament back so he could raise money so he could go and invade Spain for the Duke of Buckingham, which is going to lead to the Duke of Buckingham being stabbed to death, right? So, this whole fight back and forth between Parliament and them is going to be insane. And then after, that happens to the Duke of Buckingham, he's just distraught. Apparently after George Villers, the Duke of Buckingham, gets stabbed to death by that person that he passed over for a promotion, and after he, does all this other crazy stuff, and after he signs the Petition of Right, Charles just dissolved Parliament, like again. Like he just did it again. He's like, okay, I'll sign that document. You're going to give me the money? I'm going to go invade France? I'm going to fail? Okay, cool. And then just shuts the door and dissolves them again, right? So he fires them, and this leads to a very long period of time where he literally ruled without Parliament for 11 straight years, right? So like 11 years, which is unheard of in English history. And this time period is called the 11 Years of Tyranny, right? And so a lot of people refer to it as that. Charles didn't refer to it as that at all. Charles had Whitehall modernized even more, had more paintings put in by Rubens, had all this different stuff, had tried to like get more unemployed people employed, tried to modernize the country, tried to build more roads, tried to do all this stuff. Because during this time, where are you getting all the money for that, though, from, big guy? Well, he's getting it from ship money, that thing that his dad did, right? Either give me a boat or give me the money for a boat, right? He did that. He fined people every time that there was a ceremony where they would be coronated or knighted, which is really dumb, because how many people are you going to be able to do that for in the first place? He's going to grant monopolies to certain companies on trade goods. He's also going to just go into crippling debt. Like, he's just going to keep borrowing money from all these different countries and just basically begging for money from them, and then spends it not only on himself, but also on his initiatives, right? And the whole time, apparently, after the Duke of Buckingham died, and during these 11 years, apparently Henrietta and Charles just fell in love so hard, right? Like, so they were just like so into each other, and they were just like, oh, you were right, Henrietta. I didn't need that stupid Parliament. She's like, yeah, you're right. I was right, right? So like, and they apparently just fell in love with each other so hard, and they were just like, oh, I love you. I love you too. Oh, you're such a strong king and you're so aggressive. And it was actually at the very, very beginning of this 11 years of tyranny that they actually had their first son, and his name was going to be Charles as well. And then they had their second son during the 11 years of tyranny as well, and they named him James. Get new names, y'all. Like, get some new names. Like, we don't need to keep calling the same people the same stuff. But apparently Henrietta's like, you don't ever need Parliament. They're just stupid and smelly, and they've been always standing in your way. And then he's like, I know. And she's like, I know. So what's going on, though, in the whole nutshell is that apparently the king and queen are happy, and but then it blows up in his face, all right? So because you can't do certain things without Parliament. Doesn't matter if you think they're useless. Doesn't matter if you want to do whatever or whatever. Well, a big thing that ends up happening is under the advisement of one of his bishops, right? Of course, that whole thing his dad set up, no bishop, no king. So under the advisement of one of his bishops, they were like, we need to rebuild a lot of these monuments that got destroyed under Henry VIII. We need to rebuild a lot of that stuff. And we also need to force the Scottish to adopt Anglicanism and stop playing around with all this Presbyterian nonsense, right? So what ends up happening is Charles tries to force the Book of Common Prayer, which was originally written under Edward VI's reign, which outlined how Anglican Mass works. He tried to force that on Scottish Presbyterians. And they were like, no. Like, so we're not doing that. And so basically the subjects of his country, because he is both the king of Scotland and England, because of the unification of the crowns, right? Because he is himself Scottish, right? So like, they are just like, nah, we're not doing that. We're Presbyterian. We don't do that. We have really long masses. We think yours are lame. We're not doing it. Like, so, and then Charles is like, oh! And so he has to fight a war, right? He has to go up there and force the Scottish to suppress themselves, because what the Scots end up doing is they end up starting to like ransack churches, right? And they start burning Anglican things, and they start freaking out, right? And then on top of all that, some other stuff happens with Ireland a little bit later. But basically, when he tried to force this Book of Common Prayer on them, the Bishops' War broke out, right? And the Bishops' War breaks out, and so he has to bring back Parliament after those 11 straight years just to fight the Scots off, right? Just to get them to chill out. And this time period was known as the Long Parliament, because Long Parliament had to actually be in session for a long time because they were fighting in the midst of this war, right? And so amidst all this Long Parliament shenanigans, the Parliament is going to try and pass a bunch of acts, right? So a crazy thing's going to break out really, really soon. And if some of y'all have noticed this whole time, you're like, isn't the 30 Years' War like all kinds of going on back in Europe? It is, all right? So, like, well, what's happening, though, is the Parliament forces Charles to sign a couple of acts, right? They're like, all right, one, we're going to get you to sign the Triennial Act, right? And the Triennial Act is going to be passed by Parliament, forcing the Parliament to convene every 3 years, bare minimum, right? To make it so another 11 years of tyranny never happens again, okay? So, and then what ends up going down is a new rebellion rises up in Ireland, right? And Charles has no power to stop both of those rebellions. And then also, in the process of all this craziness, the Parliament wants to demonstrate to Charles who really has the authority. And he has this very, very, very close advisor, right? And this advisor gets brought in on charges of treason against the community, treason against this country of England. And they go up to Charles and be like, you know your new best friend? You know how your last best friend, the Duke of Buckingham, got stabbed to death by that guy? So your new best friend, we're going to accuse him of treason and conspiracy to commit like treason against the country, and we're going to have him executed. And we're going to force you to sign the execution note. So Charles, cryingly, was forced to sign a letter which would lead to the execution of his best friend. And he's got rebellions going on in Scotland and in Ireland, and he has no power to stop both rebellions. So this Parliament is like laughing in his face. All right, so, and who out of everyone do you think is just fed up with all this stuff? That's right, Henrietta, right? Henrietta's like, you signed that? What is the matter with you? And apparently the whole him signing his own best friend's death certificate actually happened when Henrietta was back in France visiting family, right? She was back in France visiting family. She's like, I'm gone for 5 minutes. And I come back and your best friend's been executed and there's 2 rebellions going on and all this other crazy stuff. What are you doing? And then she also tells Charles, it's like, I also heard that the word on the street is that the Parliament instigated these rebellions to force you to bring them back so that you would actually do what they say. What? You're telling me there's a rumor saying that the Parliament is doing all this on purpose just to make it so they can exert their authority over the king? Oh, no, 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 right? And so Henrietta whispers in his ear and says, you need to go down there and you need to arrest the 5 leaders of Parliament and you need to execute them to show them what's up, right? And so we're going to pick up right there in class whenever he walks his little tail down there and he tries to open up the doors of the Parliament. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Y'all have a good one.